MessianTics Podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
Welcome to MessianTics. I'm joined by Rabbi David, Rabbi Toby, Rabbi Jonathan, and we're going to discuss something today that I hope will be entertaining and educational. And we're going to discuss current events in light of biblical prophecy and those kind of thoughts. And we're going to share our opinions. Our opinions do not make them always right, but it also doesn't make them always wrong. As we get into this, I've been a believer for 44 years, and in those years I've watched as prophetic voices rose and fell. I remember 88 reasons why Yeshua was going to return in 1988, and then 89 reasons why he was going to return in 89. I remember all those things that have happened, and I've listened to prophecy preachers proclaim, in the year 2000, Y2K, all the things that went on, the nonsense of the British, all the stuff. And so in most cases, I've watched these things and I've looked and I've said, okay, there's certain events the Bible talks about that haven't happened yet. So until those things happen, I'm going to sit back and watch from an outsider's point of view. I'm not buying into this. A couple of those things are, the events of Isaiah 19 haven't happened yet. That's the prophecy that says that at some point in the future, Israel is going to be one with Egypt and Assyria. They're going to worship the God of Israel, speak the language of Israel. There'll be a highway from top to bottom. And we've never seen that prophecy fulfilled before our eyes. For those that are unaware, Assyria, Egypt, and the land of Israel or Canaan is the entirety of promised land given to Abraham. So we've never, since Abraham, seen the promised land actually in the hands of God's people in its entirety. So that's one of those things. So I watch and I say, okay, if Isaiah 19 hasn't happened, then there's more that has to happen before we get to the end times. And remember, Isaiah 19 happens before Isaiah 11. Isaiah 11 is the prophecy that talks about the plowshares or the swords being beaten into plowshares and the end of war. That's in 11, but 19 talks about this time where the nations rising up and things that happen in the end of that.
Are you proposing that the way that end-time prophecy flows in prophetic books is not necessarily chronological?
Absolutely.
How could you?
I know, it's shocking.
And I just want to say, for context, not to interrupt or take it, for me, because everybody talks about the last days.
Right.
Last days, the end times, the last days. And if somebody asks me, what do you think about the end times? My response is, I think the end times started when Yeshua was born. I think that was the beginning of the last days.
Right.
Yeshua's been saying he's coming soon since Revelation.
Yep, right. Well, if you divide time into 2,000-year segments,
right,
which there is biblical precedent to look at the first 2,000 years, the second 2,000 years, and the last 2,000 years. If Yeshua's birth begins the last 2,000 years, we're in the end times,
right? Because
it's the end third of the three before the 7,000th year. So as you look at that, you can look at it that way. But when we read in Isaiah 17, and this is where I was going at the beginning of this conversation, Isaiah 17 talks about Damascus. This is the burden to Damascus. Behold, Damascus will cease as a city and will become a ruinous heap. And that had not ever happened. Damascus is one of the oldest cities in history.
Never in all of history.
Right. It's been there. Damascus has been there. Damascus has been there. But now we're seeing, and I'm not saying this is it, the activity that's going on through the war going on in Syria and the between all of the different factions and all the destruction that's taking place in Damascus does not mean that Damascus will be totally destroyed this time. Mm-hmm. But as I watch what's going on, this is the first time in my lifetime that we looked at the possibility of Damascus being turned into rubble before our eyes. And if that is, then we could be seeing what Isaiah was talking about begin in this process.
Also, interesting note is when ISIS tried to take over Syria, and in Iraq, their thing was always, Israel, we're coming for you next. But when the rebels took Damascus, their first thing was, Israel, we don't want any heat with you.
Just to give, not that we have to make it a history lesson, because I just recently listened to somebody talk an hour about this, but if you could give some context on, in case somebody's like, well, what's happening in Syria? What is happening there right now that has triggered this conversation?
Which version of what's happening do you want?
I mean,
just a general 30,000 view.
Okay, 30,000 foot view. There's even two of those.
There you go.
Yeah, there's two of those views.
Pick the one that seems most likely to be somewhat accurate.
I mean, I didn't mean to throw a
middle of the two.
Okay, I will give. There's the predominant view and understanding that you will hear on legacy media streams is that Assad's regime was basically wanted to be, it was dictatorial, tyrannical, and so you had a segment of the nation that became rebellious and have been leading rebellions since about 2011, 13, somewhere around there. And the only reason I know that is because I've been following this war loosely since I was in high school. And there's been a lot of different stuff, but that's basically the gist of it. Is there's been a on and off rebellion. It's gained strength, waned in strength. And
it succeeded recently.
Yeah, it recently has succeeded. So Assad has fled. There's no real consensus on where he is at the moment, although most believe Russia, and that
which the two most likely options are Russia or Tehran.
So is right now everybody fighting over who's going to.
So basically, the groups that are there now that make up the quote unquote rebel faction are basically settling into who's going to have power and where, and what are we going to do with the nation now.
And understand that we're dealing with a combination of different things. We have the 5 main factions of Islamic groups
that are in Syria, which, by the way, borders Israel,
right? Which are fighting amongst themselves now to fill the vacuum of Assad, who don't get along with each other. Some are backed by Russia, some are backed by Iran, some are backed by Turkey, some are backed by the U.S.
Enemy is my enemy.
Right. So they're all fighting. They were all kind of fighting together against Assad, but now they're fighting amongst themselves. And then when you add to that equation the Christians in Syria and
there a lot?
And the Kurds, there's a good sizable.
Syria has been one of the most significant Middle Eastern Christian communities since the Apostles.
Yep.
Right. And then you have the Kurds.
And much like the history of the city of Damascus, the history of the Syrian Christian community has been historically substantially standing.
Right. And then you have the Kurds, so you have this whole community within Syria that's actually would be Kurdistan if a country was going to be between Syria and Turkey and Iraq, this group of Kurds. So you have these segments that are fighting amongst themselves, and then you have the response of Israel, which has been to take out Syria's military strength during this vacuum so that whoever took over, if it was one of the Islamic factions, they would not have the chemical weapons, the planes, the naval power to come after them. But this is the first time in modern history, at least, and in world history, really, that Damascus has been threatened with actual destruction.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is one of the things that paved the way for this particular success was, oddly enough, the idiocy of Iran, because you had Hamas, obviously October 7th, Hamas attacks Israel, and there's been a continual war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Then the Houthis in Yemen get involved, which are backed by Iran. Then Hezbollah gets involved in Lebanon, and they're in Syria too, but Lebanon is primarily where they're coming from, and they're backed by Iran. And Assad's regime was backed by Iran, and so Iran is now funding 2 to 3 phases of war against Israel, and they didn't have the ability to truly back Assad the way they normally had. So the rebels went, oh, Iran's out the picture, let's do this. And they went in and ran Assad out of power. And then to make things more complicated or interesting, depending on your perspective, Hamas is, just short of no longer existing at this point. They have no real abilities to do anything. Hezbollah is just being demolished, not as rapidly as we'd like, but they are not what Hezbollah was previous. The Houthis are embarrassing themselves left and right, and so on. So not only has Iran's influence or inability to be as influential as they want to be in the area been diminished, but what happened in Syria is directly related to that. And now Israel, not only are they taking out the Syrian military side specifically so they don't fall in the wrong hands, but they're also, they moved into, most people don't realize there's a demilitarized zone between at the borders of Israel and Syria, and it's been there for ever. It's very intentional
since the 6 Day War.
Is that the Golan Heights?
In the Golan Heights area, it's been you can stand in the Golan and see where the border is, but you can also see where there's no man's land. Nobody's going to walk there. And so Israel said, hey, things are in flux in Syria. We got too much going on already. We're not risking this DMZ. So they took over the DMZ on the Syrian side. They're not saying, hey, this is our land now.
Not to occupy, just to
they're
protect.
we're just protecting ourselves until the dust settles. Once the dust settles and we see where things are going, we'll back out. We just want to make sure that we have our 6 covered. And so so have we covered? I think we've covered most of where it's at right now, right?
Yeah,
best I can
because
think.
My next question was going to be connecting it back to Isaiah 11, where we started, where God says that Damascus
17. Yeah.
What is that a precursor towards? What's the significance of God telling us that is going to happen?
So let me jump in here and to set that conversation up.
Okay.
Part of what Rabbi Eric was talking about early in the opening was this idea that there have been all these theories of when Messiah is coming back that have been proposed all over the place, right? And honestly, the reality is, since John wrote John's Revelation and believers started reading it, every generation since then has looked at Revelation and went, today is the day. This is happening now. And for 2,000 years we've been playing the same game and proving ourselves wrong time and time again. But here's the reality of it. Almost all of those theories, 1,988 reasons why he was coming back in 80 or whatever it was, most of those reasons listed had to do with America, had to do with Europe, had to do with all these things. But literally all biblical prophecy, and especially end-time prophecy, hinges on the Middle East.
Yes.
On Israel, Syria, Egypt, on Lebanon, on Turkey, on this whole region of the Middle East.
Saudi Arabia.
Yes, Saudi Arabia, to some degree Iraq and so on, but all end-time biblical prophecy hinges on the Middle East. So I don't give a crap what's happening in America and whether or not it plays into
prophetically.
Hang on, let me finish what I'm saying. Whether or not it plays into end-time prophecy, I don't give a crap what's happening in Rome and Russia, and whether or not none of that matters if it's not also happening in the Middle East, and particularly in Israel. And this is one of the things I started talking about after October 7th, really heavy when I do speaking engagements and at our synagogue, is October 7th, I think really opened up prophetically the direction we're going. I don't think it's a marker of we're anywhere yet. but that was something profound that has changed things dramatically, because you've seen two particular things happen. One is we've seen a significant portion of the body of Messiah has come together in unity of Israel, but we've also seen how almost the entire world has turned against Israel more vocally than ever before in history of the modern state of Israel. And we know, prophetically speaking, the world will turn against Israel.
Yes.
Right? So what we're seeing now is that all of the pieces to the puzzles that people have been looking at everywhere but Israel and the Middle East are starting to, like, the chessboard is starting to get set in the Middle East. And so now is when we as believers need to go, hey, we need to keep our eye on what's happening here. We need to get, Rabbi Jonathan mentioned legacy media and so on. We need to have good sources of what's happening on the ground in the Middle East, because that's how we know what's going to happen. That's where we see the signs and times of the seasons and what's going on. We need to be alert to that. And so in particular discussion of Damascus and whether or not this is the fall of Damascus or this is a precursor to the fall of Damascus, I don't pretend to have the answer to.
Sure.
But the fact that Damascus has fallen in some degree, it hasn't been destroyed, but it has fallen, it definitely rings to precursor or main event of this particular prophecy. And so what we're starting to see now are these prophecies that deal specifically with the Middle East in pointing towards the return of Mashiach are starting to heat up. And I'm not going to say that they're being fulfilled in a finality sense yet.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
But they are starting to heat up. Things are starting to get interesting. I threw out the chessboard, the pieces are being set on the chessboard, because that's really what it is. And so I think we need not so much a attempt at trying to determine the hour and the time of the return, but I think what it should be for the body of Messiah, and maybe this is like end episode conversation I'm jumping ahead of, I don't know, but I think what it should be for the body of Messiah is we should start going, oh wait, this is a wake-up call, right? I will go and make disciples, and I will be with you even to the end of the age. Like for the last 1,800 years, we've been more focused on building the church, big C, big theory, the church, and not so much on building the kingdom. Like, we need to start building the kingdom. We need to start going out and making disciples for Yeshua, not disciples for our local congregations, but we need to start actually bringing the gospel, because we're getting down in time. Whether it's the next 10 years, the next 100 years, the next 1,000 years, I don't pretend to have an answer to that, but we're watching things heat up, which means that the necessity for the body of Messiah to actually do what we were called to do in the blood of Messiah needs to actually happen.
Yeah, it's interesting when you go back in history that pre the establishment of Israel, all prophecy was kind of spiritualized.
Yep.
Then Israel becomes a nation
in a day, right?
Right, in a day, and suddenly we turn back to, well, maybe the Bible's actually talking about Israel and not spiritual Israel. And then back in the 80s, the rise of Iraq and Persia comes back, because everything before that was Persia was a spiritual thing and not an actual nation.
Yeah.
And so we see these changes as the reality that what the Bible said it actually meant. And
you meant
that
Iran. You meant Iran.
Iran.
Yeah.
Iran. Well, the war between Iran and Iraq.
Yeah.
Before then, you didn't look at those nations as powerhouses or world threats. And suddenly they're back in that. And so we're seeing this stuff change, and we're starting to see that, when it talks about the nation to the north, it might actually be talking about Turkey. And when it talks about Persia, it might actually be talking about Persia. And when it talks about Egypt, it might actually be talking about Egypt. And then when we look at these things and we say, well, Damascus has fallen and it may be destroyed, then we start looking at, okay, well, what is happening? And the end result of that is that there's a point in time where the whole world turns against Israel and joins in forces against Israel. And at that point, Israel is made up of Assyria, Israel, and Egypt as one nation serving the God of Israel. And then you look and say, well, what about these Abraham Accords that are forming, where, in my young days, you'd have never thought of Saudi Arabia and Syria, like, in their threat as a result of taking the rebels were coming after Israel and Saudi Arabia as if they're partners in this, and Jordan at peace in Israel, and Egypt at peace with, in this realm. These are things that would have never been even contemplated back when I was a kid and are now in place. But at the same time, we're seeing anti-Semitism on the rise in Australia and in Russia and in Europe and in the United States, and all of this rising up against Israel, and people in Congress speaking against Israel, and all of this stuff happening. And if you just want to get angry, just look at some of the social media and their talk about how Israel is controlling everything, and how Israel controls the United States, and Congress is controlled by the Jews, and all the money is controlled by the Jews, and all of this stuff going on, and these false claims that are promoting this anti-Semitism. It's much more where we could see the end of these things happening that Isaiah is talking about now than it was ever before, with a basis of prophecy actually being talking about the land the Bible talked about.
And I just want to say that what Rabbi Eric's talking about with this open anti-Semitism, and I know that you know this, but it's always existed. It really always has. I mean, I remember I used to teach U.S. history. That's one of the things me and Rabbi Jonathan share is a love for history. But I would teach U.S. history, so I'd read a lot about things. And once it got to a certain point where technology allowed presidents to record whatever happened in their offices, Richard Nixon was big on recording everything he did, which I think eventually probably hurt him. But he catches the great Reverend Billy Graham in a conversation in his Oval Office about how the Jews control everything. This is Dr. Billy Graham. And I don't take away from what he did, but he did not speak well of Jewish people. And he said, well, those Jews, they control Hollywood and this, that, and the other, and the media and stuff. So that has been said even by I guess the best of folks.
The guy who did Ford Motor Company, produced a anti-Semitic newspaper that was out. So we see IBM helped the Nazis with the computer system that
data
counted and data entered all the Jews in Germany so that the Nazis could find who was Jewish and know who they were.
So it's never gone away.
Anti-Semitism has been around for ages, but this is the first time that we see
it trending.
And the biblical nations that the prophecies are talked about being in play at the same time that we're seeing this rise of anti-Semitism worldwide.
And,
go ahead.
And I want to add to the discussion that not only are we watching these things play out, but each of the countries that Rabbi Eric brought up earlier that have kind of reappeared as powers in the world, right? Turkey, which was the Ottoman Empire, and before that was my mind just went blank. But either way, Turkey has been a prophetically and historically in the Middle East has been a big player. Kind of wasn't on the scene for a while in terms of influence in Ottoman Empire and so on. Now it's back.
It was the Byzantine before that.
Okay, and then you go back to Persia, and now Iran is a world player to some degree. You've got Egypt. You've got all of these different pieces to the puzzle that 100 years ago nobody would have gave a care about, right? They didn't play in. As Rabbi Eric said, for most believers, they viewed those as now being spiritual extrapolations, not physical extrapolations.
But
prophetically. Now they're physical because they've reappeared on the scene again. And what's interesting to me is while we wait for the return of Messiah, we also are waiting for the rise of the anti-Messiah. And the anti-Messiah, if you look at Scripture, the anti-Messiah will be, in essence, a counterfeit of the Messiah, right? The opposite of who Yeshua really is.
He'll broker a false peace.
Yeah. And for me, the kind of common denominator between these returning nations that are big pieces to the prophetic puzzle is Islam. Right, they're all Islamic nations, and now they all bicker back and forth between themselves too, and whatever. But they're all Islamic nations, and not only are they all Islamic nations, but Islam in and of itself is a counterfeit of the biblical faith,
Yeah.
across the board. And personally, I'm of a mindset that it's possible that the anti-Messiah will rise out of Islam. There's a lot of debate over that, and I know that there are those that have a opinion that it'll be a Jewish person. There are those that obviously are the opinion it's going to be the Pope, and others that it's going to be Obama. Or I have a really good friend that swears up and down that
Prince Charles,
that the talk show host, been around forever, Oprah. I have a friend that swears up and down Oprah's the anti-Messiah. So there's all kinds of theories out there.
It's going to be my next book. Why Whoopi is the Antichrist.
Exactly. I am of the opinion that it's possible the anti-Messiah will rise out of Islam, because everything about Islam is counterfeit to the biblical faith. To
the Mahdi, which is the
exactly
the
the final Mahdi, which is their Messiah-like figure, and so on. And so it's interesting to me that the common denominator that ties all of those nations together and is the denominator that brought them back into the picture again is the very thing that's a counterfeit of biblical faith, which is Islam. And I think that plays into, and obviously we can just watch the way things are playing out now. You look at the UN, all of their sympathy is to the Islamic nations who make up 98% of the Middle East, 99.5% of the Middle East, something like that. But all of their aggression is at Israel, which is this little tiny speck of the Middle East.
And then when you add to that the recent nativity scene at the Vatican, which has the baby Jesus laying wrapped in cloth,
the black
of
and white checkered keffiyeh
of Palestine, which is showing support for the Palestinian cause,
and that the PLO was involved in that.
Right, and so we see this rising up of a recognition or a leaning towards the, we have kids in our nation that have no idea where Palestine was or who these people were or the history of it, that are marching at colleges and setting up sympathy camps and all that for it. At the same, so we're seeing,
and at the same time, you get Jewish kids who are paying tuition who can't go to class because they're afraid for their life.
Right. So you have the rise of anti-Semitism and the rise of Islam worldwide, and the rise of these nations again that were talked about in biblical prophecy. So if you're at all thinking about Bible end time stuff, you should be at least alert to what's happening. And then when we add the fall of Damascus to this equation, it very well, and I'm not saying it is, but everybody looking at this situation should be awake and aware, and it should cause every believer to look at where their heart is concerning Israel, because the line of choice, the dividing line, the who is on God's side and who is not, is being made clearer and clearer. And those that
sheep
love
and goat are being separate.
Those that love and support Israel are going to be on one side of that line, and the others are going to choose to serve the anti-Messiah, whoever that is. And with the rise of Islam and Islamicists and all that in that role, and if you listen to the leaders of these factions, they're all trying to become the leader of the caliphate and reestablish the Levant, or the Arabic or the Islamic control over the empire, and become the one. And so this is biblical prophecy playing out right in front of our eyes, at least in appearance, in a way that has never taken place. All of the parts are there now without it being symbolized, where we're saying, oh, this is a symbolic, like Russia is this or China is that or whatever. Now we're seeing the actual nations the Bible talked about rising up into place, and we're seeing not symbolism of, but reality of these things taking place.
And it's important as believers, because I think some people have this mindset of, well, I have Jesus, I'm good. And I'm like, well, here's the thing. There's nothing new under the sun. The disciples themselves, after Yeshua had been walking around just a few years, one of their questions was, hey, how do we know you're going to come back? I mean, that's what I love about that's in the scriptures. because it shows that, they wanted to know too. I'm like, yeah, of course. Just like we want to know, hey, when are you coming back? And the first thing Yeshua said wasn't, okay, here's what's going to happen. I mean, he does go into that, but the first thing he says is, don't be deceived. And another thing that he says is that the love of many will grow cold, which means there will be people who will have a love for God, but their love will grow cold. And I believe it's going to be because of persecution. I think that persecution really tests your love and heart for God. And I think that whenever that time comes, and I'm not an 88 Reasons person either, but Yeshua spoke. He didn't say, don't worry about the end times. He didn't say that. He gave 80 scriptures. He didn't go, don't worry about it. I'm just going to come back and take care of it all. He goes, don't be deceived.
Yep.
And then, of course, he goes into things. He talks about Daniel. He references Daniel.
Yep.
Daniel has a lot of intense imagery about end times and things like that. But what I'm saying is that you can't think, guys, no, nobody's telling you to get on Facebook and talk about the 88 reasons or talk about building a bomb shelter. But at the same time, Yeshua did not say, don't worry about that. He said, don't be deceived, and which means we should be paying attention, and we should be sober, and we should be alert, because it says that even the elect can be deceived. And that's I don't want to say it's scary, but it's saying that you should be self-examining.
It's sobering.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Well, and it's reassuring to me that, like, it's not necessarily up to me to have to figure it all out.
No.
Because, there's always been such a focus on end times and apocalyptic understanding and imagery.
Right.
So much so that we have, it's some of the most predominant Jewish literature of the first century is apocalyptic literature. And, one of the reasons why there were so many zealot groups in Jerusalem during Yeshua's day, you had the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots. You had so many different zealot factions, was because all of them were doing the math out of Daniel. Yeah. So they, way back then, they were doing the math on Daniel's, 70 weeks, So, because people today, there's countless websites and blogs, people doing the math to try to figure out how Daniel's weeks play out for today. They were doing it back then.
Yep.
And that's why that's why they were like, hey, now is the time. And that's why they were zealots then. Yep. And so I'm like, well, they were trying to figure it out, and we're trying to figure it out. And I think Yeshua's apostles definitely had the upper hand.
So as we get ready to wrap this up.
Well, I actually have one more question.
Okay, go ahead.
Just because, so what really too, so this thing with Damascus and Syria, do you see it as because of the political instability from the civil war, that maybe a more powerful will come in, a more powerful country? I don't see Syria from the ground up growing and growing and growing. Then again, I don't know.
Nothing ever grows from the ground up.
But I feel like with the political instability, some bigger player would take advantage.
Yeah, whether it's a bigger player or it's a unifying of the Islamists within, there's going to be a rising up, I believe, of a new leadership within Damascus. And in the battle to have that happen, I think that we'll see the actual destruction of Damascus take place.
And this is more...
Just like we saw the destruction in Iraq, just like we saw the destruction in other places when the Islamic sects came in. In Syria, in many places in Syria, it's already been destroyed because of the battles between the different facets of Islamic groups.
And this is something I've always felt, and this is more of like a bonus question because it's kind of it's related but unrelated. The scripture does talk about a temple where an abomination of desolation has to take place. So do you believe that believers should be looking out for the building construction of a temple in Israel?
That's a great question, and honestly, I don't know. Here's there's three basic things. One is that a temple will be built before. One is that a temple will be built after, and one is that the actual temple in heaven will come down and Yeshua will rule from that. And I think all three of them are valid approaches to what's going to happen, but there will be a temple just not sure what's going to happen to bring that about.
But I thought there had to be an abomination of desolation.
Well, in theory, Daniel's abomination of desolation has already occurred. That was the story of the Hasmoneans and Hanukkah and so on.
I would relegate that to Titus.
Yeah.
At the destruction of the temple.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because he makes sacrifices to Jupiter in the temple.
But aside from and that's the thing too is
maybe for another episode.
Yeah, that's the thing. Well, we still got a few minutes. I want to bring up a couple of things to it. One is not all prophecy in Scripture is a one and done situation.
Most prophecy is a short term and a long term.
Okay.
Yeah, and so it's not uncommon to see what we know as end time prophecy have played out several times, just wasn't the time. But aside from that, the other thing to keep in mind, and you asking about the temple, the rebuilding the temple and so on is kind of a key example of that. End time prophecy is one of those things that, so we'll say it this way. You've got your pre-trib, your post-trib, your mid-trib rapture people, right? And they always debate and argue back and forth and whatever. But the reality is all three use the exact same scriptures to support their point of view, right? And so the reality is if we can look at a set of scriptures and have three different perspectives come out of it, then that means that we actually don't really fully understand it, so we can't possibly know, right? And that's the issue with end time prophecy is, for the most part, and this is why nailing a date down is so complicated, and also why Yeshua tells us not to bother with it, is because end time prophecy is not as easy to understand as we want it to be. That's why I make it a point to say, keep your eyes on, like watch what's happening, because we've watched Matthew 24, Luke 21. We see those things that Yeshua blatantly says they've been playing out for 2,000 years, and it's getting worse now. But that doesn't mean that 1,000 years ago they weren't saying the same thing. And we've been watching this for 1,000 years, and it's getting worse now.
We've been watching this for 30 years,
exactly. And so the reality is there isn't a simplistic understanding of end time prophecy, which is why there are varied views on what will happen. I think what's important and what we should be doing is going, hey, I actually realize I don't have all the answers. So how about we find middle ground on the word, which is where we meet, right? We meet in the middle at the word. We then take that in 2 different tracks, 3 different tracks, whatever, but we meet in the middle of the word. How about we find unity in the middle, which is the word of God, and then we let God see how it's going to play out.
Sure.
We just keep our eyes alert, right? Now, each of us at the table, we have our own perceptions on how things are going to play out. We have our own theories, I guess is a better way of describing it. We have our own theories on how things are going to play out. But I'm sure all of us, like I'm more than willing to say, this is my theory. Like, I'm not saying thus saith the Lord. This is my estimation based off of what I'm seeing in the overall message of the prophecies in Scripture. But it's just my theory. I could be wrong, and I'm okay with. Like, I joke with people. I don't buy into a pre-trib rapture train of thought. But
you'd love it if it.
But I always say, look, I'm fine with being wrong. Like, that's a much better deal.
Just gets
like,
up in there.
You mean I get to go away before the crap hits the fan, dude? I'm on board. Let's make that happen.
Right.
I don't think that's going to be the case, but I'm rooting for that over my theory.
It all comes down to this, and you guys may have more to say, but this will be my close, is that Yeshua said, occupy till I come. Live until I come. I asked an old preacher one time when I first became a believer about end time fulfillments, and he said, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you're not when he comes back, but what is your situation, what is your life, what is your walk when he comes back. And we can get caught up in so concerned with things happening or not happening that we're so busy occupying ourselves with when things are going to happen that we don't actually live out our faith, that we're not actually discipling, that we're not actually doing what is required of us now to prepare for his return. Because if you're prepared, it doesn't matter when he comes back. If you're making disciples and doing what we're called to do, it makes no difference when he comes back. That doesn't mean we can't see. He says that the sailors know from the sky what's happening. We can know the signs and the seasons. We're not going to know the day and the hour, but we can know the signs, and we should know those things. but it's more important that we're doing and we're prepared for him coming than it is for us to know when he's coming.
And that we're preparing others to be prepared.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and with that, we're going to go ahead and close out unless Rabbi Jonathan has something he wants to add. And we hope this has been at least informative for you. If you have any comments or questions, things you'd like us to talk about in a future episode, put it in the comment section of whatever medium you're listening to this on, and we will see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.